Welcome everyone. I welcome you all to C-City Conversations, which is the school's outreach program. As a part of this program, we organize events, lectures, symposia, and exhibitions in order to engage with the larger artistic and cultural discourses sphere within and outside the city. Over the last few semesters, we have started organizing curated symposia, which take up a very focused kind of inquiry and call various speakers who can help us to expand and also kind of think through these inquiries together. Before I go on to just kind of introduce you to this semester's inquiry points, I would like to acknowledge the support of Urban Centre Mumbai, which has come on board with C to partly support this event for the semester. And just to kind of give a brief introduction to the organization, Urban Centre Mumbai is a part of the Urban Centre Trust, which is a young not-for-profit organization, and it was established in 2020 by city practitioners. It aims to build capacities and create democratic platforms to achieve and demonstrate excellence in the planning and design of rapidly growing urban agglomerations in India. So that was about Urban Centre Mumbai. And now I would like to kind of give a very small introduction to this semester's inquiry point, like I said, or the curatorial note, which we thought to be around the idea of second cities primarily, but we call it beyond the metropolis, which is basically to suggest a symposium which kind of investigates into the shifting coordinates of urban imagination. Urban conditions beyond metropolises in India have been largely viewed as inward-looking enclaves of local economy, culture, and politics. Urban life is considered to unfold here in the shadow of globally connected and much sought after world-class metro cities through illegible property rights, social interactions enmeshed in very primordial communal passions, the architecture of urban form that lends towards social segregation and so on. So as emerging contexts fuel the explosion of such urban conditions, India's urban turn has decisively poised towards the growth of small cities during the last decades. So this series of C conversations is an attempt to invite artists, architects, filmmakers, and urbanists to offer provocations on how we could read into and engage with the multiple emerging presents and futures of urban life, urban form, and architecture beyond our general focus areas of the metropolis. And in order to discuss that, we have already had 3 sessions in the last 2 months. And this is our fourth session where we have, this is our third session. We have had 2 sessions in the past. And today we have Pratyush Shankar, who will be giving us a cross section of the evolution of cities in India. But before I pass on the mic to Pratyush, I'd like to introduce him formally. Professor Pratyush Shankar is a practicing architect and an academic, and he has been teaching urban history and design for many years now. He has authored the book titled Himalayan Cities, Settlement Pattern, Public Places and Architecture in 2014, and also a few others. And he has delivered lectures and seminars in various universities around the world and has published widely, like I said. He has received numerous fellowships and awards for his work on Indian architecture and cities. Currently, he is the Dean of School of Environmental Design and Architecture at the Navrachna University in Vadodara. And he's a visiting professor and architecture faculty at TU Darmstadt, Germany. His forthcoming book is History of Urban Form in India, which is being published by the Oxford University Press. So with that introduction, I would like to invite Pratyush to open the talk today. So over to you, Pratyush.
Thank you. Thanks, Anuj. Thanks, Anuj, for this introduction, and thanks to you and your institute, Rupali, Sanna, everyone in your institute for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to come and interact with you guys. It's very very enriching for me. And I think you have laid out a very nice background to the whole lecture series. And I was, very much intrigued and interested in the kind of conceptual frameworks you're offering when you say cities beyond the metropolis. In some sense, even though I'm saying that this is a talk that is on historical aspects of Indian cities, but I also believe that if we really need to understand our cities today, perhaps, or we want to decipher it further, we need to understand what have been the historical trajectories. So that, and that to my mind has been one of the key missing links in academic studies of urban history. And by, of course, when I use the word urban history could mean it's a very wide kind of a term. We are more interested in history of urban form, really, because urban history could mean many things. And what I've also observed in many architectural schools is this kind of almost a romance of the Indian cities, the old Indian cities. There is this kind of a special place for it. And a lot of it actually comes from, it's a post 1970s and 1980s phenomena when we started discovering, what we had except like the RSP, the related study program, and then many institutes started going around taking their students to various parts of the country. This is also the time in India when there was a consciousness of the Indian history and Indian tradition. You had the Upnauts, when you have, the Lok Kala Mandal. So there is this consciousness of Indianness. And I think that is where there has also been, especially when I'm talking about architectural schools, a kind of a thing about that. There's something glorious about Indian cities. And that's why I use the word romance. And at another level, you have had scholarships that have absolutely not recognized, sometimes coming from the West, that they never had cities. Well, they only had settlements. City, as we understand city, was never really there. So I think at both the ends, it's a very broad generalization. So in some sense, through my research, I've been trying to look at this problem in a much more, I would say, systematic fashion, in a much more empirical fashion, if I may use the word. But I think what I've also been trying to do is to look for frameworks that I can use, and that's why I've titled the talk "Is There an Indian City?" And to my mind, it's an unfinished project. It's work in progress, and I'm going to demonstrate to you why I feel it is work in progress. I've deliberately not used the word settlements or urban history. I've used the word city because today I want to focus more on the idea of the city. And the idea of the city, and that's the lens I'm using. I'm not particularly interested in the census definition of what a city is, but I'm looking at a city as almost a promise of something, a promise of a certain kind of diversity, a promise of ability for people to forge new identities, a promise to be able to escape a kind of a surveillance, an escape a kind of a feudal gaze, as George Simmel would have used the word, that seems to be sometimes omnipresent in rural areas. So what is it that city offers? I mean, some authors have said, I think Spiro Kostov said, it's a place of energized crowding. So it's not simply a crowd. It's not simply a collection of people, lots of people, but it is in a state of energy. Other terms, many of you would be familiar with the idea of anonymity, for example. City offers anonymity. And one thing I'm absolutely 100% convinced about: a city cannot be and should not be preserves of past communities, ethnicities. Cities cannot simply be a place where community, as we understand, coming from either a certain ethnic, religious, or social background, are able to preserve themselves, because this is a place where you mix. This is a place where you have your identity, but you also forge new identity. That is really truly the possibilities. of a city, and that is essentially an idea of a public place. So that, and I think that is a very important departure, and I think that bias or a view you would find in all the presentations that I'm going to give today. So that's a very quick kind of a background, and I will jump from one century to another century very freely, because if I don't do that, I will not be able to come up with any framework. So I purposely am not getting into too many details, but I move from one place to another. So with that, I will start sharing the screen. Start broadcast. Okay, just a minute. You can see the slides all together, right?
Yes, we can see the slides, but we have lost your but
Video.
yeah.
I think that's one of the things that we'll have to deal with, because we'll have to
Sure.
just keep, because this iPad does that. But you can see the screen right now.
Yes, that's fine.
Yeah, so that's the title of the study, and these are, as part of my research, these are the various cities, that I kind of studied in different parts of the country. And as as I said, I will move from different eras and different geographies. And first, I would like to very briefly talk about this very celebrated examples of the temple towns. We keep hearing about it, and we all know in architecture schools we are made to look at this diagram of these temple towns, and these are the different temple towns that we know about it, right? We know about the fact that they have they in fact are amongst the most ancient occurrences of cities, because prior to that we don't have many examples of the way cities existed. And also I find them to be of importance because perhaps these are the, as I said, most earliest intact cities, but I was particularly curious to understand uh, these towns from the perspective of water and control of water, modification of nature. And to my mind, too much attention has gone into the religious aspects of the town, or this whole thing about the Vastu Purush Mandal, I feel, has gone for too long. And to my mind, the major points have been missed. So these were the towns that we were interested in. There is a plethora of excellent literature that is not coming from the architecture domain, but that's actually coming from the domain of historians who have looked at this region, particularly this region around the Kaveri River. And they have correlated a lot of the kind of political history of this place with the questions of water and irrigation. But before I jump into that, so that's the kind of form. You have the temple in the center and the city organized all around the temple. This was a Srirangam is might be amongst the purest form, and then you have different kind of dilution to the form, but the archetype remains the same of the temple in the center and the kind of a city that is surrounding it, with very clear kind of a distinction that who lives where. This is where you're supposed to be. This is where you're not supposed to be. In fact, the palace is totally missing. The center is occupied by the temple, marked by these gateways that we all know about. And these are images that we have all seen. But what is most interesting, and that is where we got very much interested, is that there's this whole plethora of literature, as I said, that has looked into the larger political history of the region and how temples were very central in in controlling water and in modifying landscape and in managing water. And that's what I was interested in. And I was seeing how the city actually, or the town, gets implicated in that whole process. So obviously you do find that there is a correlation between where the temples are located, or these temple towns are located. They do not happen anywhere. They happen in certain places certain kind of geographical condition as related to the river plains. There is a certain kind of landscape that we begin to find around these temple towns that also seems to be common. And that's what we started mapping. There is a kind of a correlation that one begins to see, that the occurrences of temple town is seems to be special, and there seems to be something going on as far as the question of the immediate landscape is concerned. If one were to do a Google Earth, and that's what technology helps, a Google Earth analysis of areas around temple towns, then one find an unnaturally large number of water bodies. If one were to begin to look at these water bodies very, very carefully, then one find that none of them actually, or rather most of them, are not natural, but they were constructed in the sense that there was an effort that was made. And it's very clear from these images that there is this bund that has been made. It is almost like a check dam where an earthen bund, a long earthen bund, this would be extending sometimes almost a kilometer or more, was made. It also goes and, in some sense, connects with the earlier works that we have seen of ancient cities. Globally, it has been seen that modification of nature was something very, very central in the creation of cities, because you modify nature. All these water bodies, none of them were actually natural. And all the records, including canals and earthen bunds and all the records point towards the role of the temple as being the force that was very much interested in creation of these irrigation system. Temple as being the institution that was controlling and managing water, and hence it was central to the creation of surplus. And you find such a kind of landscape all across Tamil Nadu. And we first saw it on Google Earth, and then we would go at these places. And when you find accounts of travelers, 17th century, 16th century travelers, they all talk about the presence of these bodies, and that the fact that these water bodies had existed for a very long time. And of course, whenever we visit these places, there is a temple somewhere, there is some kind of a religiosity that is associated with these places. And these are the kind of water bodies, and none of them, the point that I'm making, are actually natural. And that's the very typical section that one begins to find. So you have, if I were to abstract the diagram, this is Sri Rangam, almost like an island. And these are all the water bodies that the temple has actually been responsible. And the temple as an authority has commissioned it. So you have this very, very interesting relationship, almost like it's a crazy relationship, where the formation of the city is absolutely correlated, or rather the growth of the city, one can even argue, is totally dependent on the modification of nature all around, because only when you modify nature, when you manage water, you can create a surplus, and which also creates a surplus for the state, which leads to bigger cities. So in the case of Tamil Nadu temple towns, it's a very interesting case where temples, and of course we do know that organized religion, in this case temples, are used to legitimize the state. But in this case, what is most interesting, and this is that the state is almost missing from the game. So you have, and then there are these records how temple towns did not occur naturally, but temple towns were established. So imagine this kind of a place where a small temple is established. It starts funding, or it starts modifying the nature all around. And finally, you get a city that would be as elaborate as Sri Rangam. So in this diagram, what I'm trying to show, so you have a smaller temple, and it begins to modify and create more water bodies. Then it becomes more powerful. There are more water bodies that comes up, and slowly you begin to get the form of the temple town that we have. It raises many questions. It raises many interesting questions. And I think the first and foremost question it raises is, why is the city so much geometrically clarified? And for too long, I think we have only been talking about Vastu Purush Mandal as a way to look at, everything, everything geometrical. That might explain the architecture of the temple, but that doesn't help me really explain uh, the city itself. And I feel the city has to be, in this particular case, a very strong, clarified diagram, because it has to perpetuate a certain kind of authority. In fact, I find it to be extremely oppressive. I find it to be extremely scary, and a sign of a kind of an autocratic rule, if I may use the word. Right. So these temple towns, and sometimes we tend to celebrate these temple towns as examples of Indian cities. But these temple towns were also towns where you were told, this is where you live, this is where you don't live, this is where you can eat, this is where you can sleep. But also it is a very, very interesting experiment where the temple itself becomes almost like a proxy to the state, and begins to control landscape all around it. And the city then becomes a vehicle, or I would rather use the word, the city becomes an instrument to perpetuate a kind of a power relationship. Now, if we were to use that framework, I think it becomes very interesting. It becomes very interesting in terms of how one can begin to look at this whole business of clarified geometry as a way. I mean, grids can be used for a variety of purpose, but in this case, it was very clear. It had to make sense. It had to have a larger impact on the region itself. And so, for a state to grow and become richer, they had to commission temples. You commission temples, the surplus grows, and the state becomes richer. So it's also very interesting, and of course, a lot of more studies can be done. The other very different example I would like to pick up is these whole Deccan cities, which have not been, I would say, not been studied in much more detail and not been celebrated also, but I think they are important. They're important from the point of view, and I'm interested in these cities, as you can see in the map. They're important from the point of view of course, the classic question in medieval cities is defense, and how does defense influence the city? That's all right. But then there's also this whole question of Islam and Sufism. Uh, and it's an interesting question for urban historians, because uh, Islam and cities, there's a very interesting correlation between the growth of Islam and the rise of Islam and the rise of cities, because Islam in its early form was essentially an urban religion, and spread by traders. So there is this very interesting relationship between that I was interested in. And then, of course, there are other questions of urbanization away from the perceived center in the north. But when we start looking at these cities, there are some very classic patterns. The word I would use is archetypes that we begin to find. Palace on the higher ground, of course, that's something very logical. That's where you have your thing. So idea of a moat, yes, that also is very logical. So you have the highest ground for the royalty, and the city below, that kind of a thing. Ideas of gates, again, a very common idea. Of course, you have a kind of a fortification or a kind of a boundary that is made up, and then the rest of the city almost kind of manages things on its own. It is there, it is an infill, uh, with some kind of a simple kind of a character. But then if we begin to, and that's where I think some interesting diagramming really helps. I was very much curious to know where is the Jami Mosque. And I was very much curious to know where the Jami Mosque is, for the very simple reason, the Jami Mosque is a city level mosque. Its rhetorical claim is that the city can, on a Friday, on a given day, can come. The city comes and prays in this mosque. So in that sense, it has a very interesting urban claim, if I may use the word. And of course, this simple pattern begins to emerge, that if you have your main gate here, and this is Daulatabad, and the palace towards an end, sometimes it is on an end, sometimes it is on a center. You have the Jami Mosque somewhere in between. Yeah, this is something we see. Even in Bidar, we begin to see that pattern emerge. So there would be many mosques, but we were looking for the original mosque. You have the palace up there, you have the gate, you have a road going there, and somewhere in the center. So the mosque almost is like a pendant in a necklace. That's the word that I've used. And that seems to be a pattern that begins to emerge, which is rather interesting because the mosque is, again, I mean, again, the same question. You do need religion to legitimize the ruler, but the mosque also belongs to the people, so it's not something that can be appropriated so easily by the state. And really, that is the prominent structure. So here, in case of Bidar, that's the mosque, and number one here is the madrasa, the famous madrasa. That is the prominent structure that one finds in the city, apart from the palace. And the rest of the city is absolutely non-hierarchical, if I may use the word. It's difficult to find uh, any great hierarchies. And then I was more interested in looking for what I would like to call a sphere, a public sphere. And that's a $1 million question, at least in my research, as to was it in a position to form spaces where different communities can meet, where a kind of a public life can be created in small ways or large ways. Definitely, the foregrounds of the mosque is the only open space that you have, and you really can't call it public. Or the foreground of the madrasa is I would really use the word community, and I make a very clear distinction between community spaces and public places. Uh, these are, we really can't call them as really public. But then something very interesting begins to happen. And this is where I feel that this is an area that one can really benefit from a lot more work, is that it is not as much as a space that is created in the city or within the city, but it is a space which is created sometimes outside the city, which is of more relevance or more importance. And in this case, there were two kinds of spaces I was looking at, and they're similar kinds in some sense. One is these tombs of Sufi saints. Now, Sufism being something so unique to Pakistan, Afghanistan, and India. And Sufism was doing a couple of things. One was it, and you always find in most example, even in the case of Delhi and other places, or Ajmer for that matter, the Sufi saint would never reside inside the city. They would always reside outside the city. They would there was always a very complex love-hate relationship between the king and the Sufi saint. Almost, I mean, there are accounts of the Sufi saint or the king being unhappy with the Sufi saint, or the Sufi saint not recognizing the king, because the Sufi or Sufism, in some sense, was absolutely antithesis to the idea of the city itself. If city was about material pleasure, uh, the spaces of Sufism was about spiritualism. It almost was showing a mirror to the state, and hence it had to be outside the city. And that is something we begin to find in many different cities in Deccan. Uh, Now, what was of interest was to us was that it was in fact the spaces of the Sufi tombs that were truly public for many reasons. One, it was popular amongst people. It was a place that would be visited by people almost like a day-long picnic. It was a place where you were not asked your caste, you were not asked your religion, and everyone was welcomed. In fact, Christoph Jaffrela, in one of the interviews, uh, has argued, and I don't know whether he has written about it, but he has argued that the spaces of Sufism in India gave that kind of a release to the tension of Indian society at that point in time. Because here was a place where you were not asked who you are and where you're from. And it's very interesting that it is the tombs or the places of these saints and the royal necropolis that became a place where people would go to spend their time, to do nothing, or to just go there. So, in some sense, one of the arguments that I finally developed towards the end of this chapter is how, in the case of, and this Deccan really, Deccan example of Deccan cities really show to us I don't know whether I would like to call it the failure of the city in creating a kind of a public sphere, but how a space, a sphere, a public life that could have or should have existed within the city actually existed outside the city. And I think that's what I learned most importantly while looking at Deccan cities, because to my mind, the presence of some, of course, these are medieval times, and this is not post-industrial time, but still cities were always about different kinds of people getting together in some state. Universally, this is historical. It's for centuries in small degrees or large degrees. So if I were to really abstract this, you have, of course, the fortification, double apron fortification. You had that, that road I was talking about with the mosque in the center, and the rest of the city practically takes care of itself. It is, of course, there is no plan. It is incremental growth and organic in nature, but not with any kind of an imagination for a space. But there is a space that kind of exists outside the city. So that's what I'm trying to argue, that here it is the suburbs, or it is a space that is not within, that is meaningful to the city. I don't know how to look at it. Maybe if there were a space within, the chances are it will be an appropriated space. That is one way to look at it. And if there is a space that is outside the city, it is in some sense a free space or an autonomous space, And Sufi and the Sufi institutions were in many ways free, not completely, but partially free of the control of the state. So that's kind of one, strand of thought. I'm just sharing different examples. That was one strand of thought that I had. But then, of course, with the Mughal cities, it gets absolutely interesting and crazy. And I've looked at Delhi, Agra, Lahore. Of course, I can't visit, so it's all secondary case studies. I think this is a very important departure. I think Mughal cities are a fantastic departure. For one, I feel it establishes a whole new set of relationship with the immediate landscape. A very conscious relationship where landscape is seen as being picturesque, to be consumed, to be you locate something keeping that in mind, which was never the case in many cities. Of course, there's a huge idea of the royal elites, and like Stephen Blake has written extensively on Shahjahanabad, on this whole idea of the royal household as the ones that are running the empire. But then what I'm more interested, and that's what I would like to, focus more on, is this whole idea of a city as a camp, really. And this word camp stuck to me, came from a lot of travelers' account, and I would like to talk about that in a while. But again, speculative. There is this whole theory and a whole literature, especially coming from looking at Babarnama, when he comes to India and he remarks that he's almost reminded he's missing the landscape back home, and this would be Fargana Valley, or the areas in Central Asia, perhaps, which is familiar, where there is running landscape, there is running water, there is much greener landscape, snow-fed rivers, and he says that there is nothing here. This is a very strange country. This is a very dry country, and it's not surprising that their attitude to making a palace is very much inspired. And we all know about this whole idea of the garden, which seems to be a very, very, very important idea in Mughal architecture and cities. Almost, the argument here being the palace itself, or the whole idea of the palace is inspired with the idea of garden. But then a very conscious effort is made to locate a palace on the bend of a river, so that you get a nice view, so that you kind of begin to enjoy nature. That's something we find in Agra, something we find in Delhi and also Lahore. But then something really radical and interesting begins to happen. Now, perhaps it is related with the fact that you had a very, very strong royal elite that had a particular attitude to landscape. Garden building was considered one of the most important acts. And the whole idea of suburban garden comes up. So the city, I don't know whether I would use the word abandoned, but if we begin to really look at a Mughal city, we need to look at all the gardens that the elites were building on the riverbanks of, of, of the Yamuna, in the case of both Delhi and Agra. And so there is this kind of an investment in the suburbs again, but this is an investment that is made by the royal elites. And they go out, purchase large parcels of land, almost like our present day farmhouses. In fact, in one drawing, we have shown this long row of gardens in the city being really, really small. Um, Many ways to look at this kind of an indulgent attitude to space making. One way, and I'm kind of, one looks at the work of Irfan Habib, where he argues in his very seminal work on Mughal economy that I don't remember the percentage, but large percentage of the economy was controlled by very few noblemen, very few royal elites. And that perhaps explains how the investment is not there as much in the city, but rather it is there outside the city in the form of these suburban gardens that extend to the river plains as riverfront garden. Now that's one kind of a strand of thought which I thought not much attention has been given to, and I was interested in exploring. Of course, Stephen Blake's work on the royal household becomes a very important reference, where he argues the formation of Shahjahanabad can be understood if we begin to locate where all the Havelis are. But again, a very interesting argument, a formal argument on the urban form, it can emerge that there is no idea of the city, but really it is an idea of a collection of Havelis of the royal elites. And we do know that what is referred to as karkhanas, or karkhanas are the craftsperson places, were essentially around these Havelis. So that's one kind of a strand of thought. But what is most fascinating, and this is something we find account after account, is this whole description of Mughal cities as, the word that has been often used is they had a camp-like feel. And that's very much interesting. And if we begin to really investigate further the life of a king, you would actually be surprised that 40% of the time, the lifetime of the king was actually spent traveling. So as much as these cities were places for the royalty to kind of indulge in these riverfront gardens, many of the time the cities were abandoned very quickly. I won't use the word abandoned, but left for some years altogether, when the king would move either to some other city or establish another capital, or the king would be on the move. And this is where we come to this whole idea of a tent city. A tent city is a moving city, and the tent city moves for kind of years together. And there's this whole historical account of how mobility was very, very important for Mughals to retain their control of the vast landscape in India, because it was through the relationships that they had formed with the local chiefs. And to keep the relationship going, they had to go there. So they would move from one part of the country to the other, and these cities would be established. And this is the city. This is, to my mind, the real Mughal city, where there is this whole, and this is all drawings that we have made from reading text. So these are not kind of invented diagrams, but based on the description of text, we have kind of made these drawings. And it really begs us, it begs the question that how then you begin to look at a city that is kind of there, invested in the suburban idea, not as invested in the city itself, but invested more in the idea of the picturesque nature that is not within the city but outside the city, but also a city that overnight, based on the whims and fancies of the king, might be abandoned. And it is abandoned because there is always a pressure to move with the king. So that's the interesting part. And I would love that somebody really picks these topics up for further exploration, because I feel somehow I've only broached the surfaces. Similarly, and I'll not get into the details of Gujarat and Rajasthan cities, but similarly, I picked up cities in Gujarat and Rajasthan. And there I was using the framework of mercantile economy, the role of merchant class. But I was also critiquing the inward-looking caste-based housing that we find many of these cities that is there, but essentially these cities were fortified market towns. That's the framework that I've used. But what I'm more interested in, and since I'm looking at different eras, and today I wanted to talk a bit more. Anuj, I have time, right?
Yes, Pratyush, you can
Yeah.
take it. Yeah.
Okay. So a bit more on the question of colonial cities, not from the point of view of its exact urban morphology, but more from the point of view of what are the frameworks I can begin to deploy. And we use the word colonial cities. And India is, I think, excellent for urban historians because you find cities that were designed and executed by the French. You have cities that were managed by the Portuguese. You have cities that, whether you had the Dutch influence, and of course you had the British cities. So it's an excellent laboratory, I would say, to understand the relationship between colonization and city formation. It can. There's so much out there that we can begin to understand much better. And if you ask me, you know, the British never really had a plan, and that is not something that I'm something that I've discovered, but this is something that has been said by different authors, that they first, around the time when it's East India Company, they they do not have a huge tradition back home, so their tradition of city building is much later. Unlike the French that had a huge tradition of city building, the British really do not come with a great plan. So the word that I've used is a pragmatic patchwork in some sense. It's a pragmatic patchwork of it's an opportunistic kind of a patchwork. You keep this here, you keep that here. And one thing is, they were very clear. In fact, in some other publication I've argued, this was in fact the dark ages for the medieval Indian cities, because Britishers never wanted to engage with the existing cities. They would always have their settlements away from the existing cities. So the existing cities really fossilized. And that is true for many older 14th, 15th century town. And of course, the first phase is marked by, and there are these very interesting accounts where officers are taken to task as to why did you spend so much money? Why did you spend so much money on the road? Why did you spend so much money building that kind of a building? So there's this constant pressure to just do bare minimum. That was kind of very important. And also the manner in which the Britishers were managing their affairs, it was more decentralized than, let's say, the French and the Portuguese. So what we also begin to find is a kind of a patchwork. It is very pragmatic, but it is a urban development of convenience without any great, at that point in time, initial phases, any great plan or great vision as to what the city should be. It is only much later that a kind of a plan begins to emerge, or a kind of a thought begins to emerge, which also is a thought or a plan that is opportunist in nature. For example, I'll give you a very simple example. A fort area was always marked by an open space all around, which is a very classic military strategy, which is which we is also referred to as an esplanade, an area around a fort, around a fortification for the purpose of protection. Yeah, and for example, in Calcutta, and that's an area, and then you have the city beyond. So once the city always started with a fort, which was also referred to as a factory sometimes, but it was essentially a place of control, and then the city that is beyond. And it is in these area, which was an open area, where in the phase two, or when they become more sure, mostly post mutiny, that they want to create, or they want to create something of more enduring value. They are getting more sure of themselves. They are beginning to also have a social life, that they begin to put these institutions. And the esplanade, because there is no purpose of that open area anymore from the point of view of defense, esplanade or this open space becomes the perfect ground to locate their new institutions. And I think that's of immense interest to me, that how these new forms of institutions, and these new forms of institutions were social institutions, they were cultural institutions, were actually not planned in as part of a great urban design or a urban planning, but were essentially was a kind of a reuse of an open space that was there for some other earlier kind of a purpose. So that seems to be what was driving. And we know about this. I'm talking about the gymkhanas, I'm talking about the sports club. If we extend the argument, we can look at cricket clubs, we can look at even other institutions of administration, libraries, and other. So what you begin to find is a kind of an attitude, and I would more as a local space planning attitude of using open spaces of foreground to frame architecture. That seems to be the larger intention. So in fact, city seems to be shaped by an intention of a kind of a frame that one needs to create, to show the building as being monumental, iconic. Of course, we know all about that, a kind of a symbolism. But the question really is, what is really happening to the city? As a larger conceptual framework that I was referring to, and again, referring to or questioning the simplistic binaries, as also appears in the work of Anthony King about black city, white city, or like there are these two Indias that existed at that point in time. And in fact, even people like Prashant Kedambe, professor in University of Leicester, has argued that how the spaces that the Britishers created, and the open spaces that they created for whatever purpose, were actually all appropriated, were all the spaces where some of the most important freedom speech were given, right? So there is this whole idea of appropriation that happened during the colonial era, and a kind of a publicness is introduced through this kind of an appropriation, which is, to my mind, a very encouraging sign in terms of creation of a city. But creation of a city not by any design, but by just fate, if I may use the word. So here, that's what I mean of beginning with a fort, larger open space around the city, again a pragmatic patchwork, and then this space really becomes an opportunity to kind of come up with certain ideas of creating urban spaces. More piecemeal, if I may use the word, rather than with any grand plan. That's some sense sticking my neck out here in arguing, which was pretty much unlike the French, because is very interesting. One is that their manner of governance was very different. They had a centralized governance system and also centralized planning. They had a huge kind of so even though the plan is drawn up by the Dutch, but in case of Pondicherry, it is the French that finally implement a plan. So this is an example of a very centralized kind of a planning. And if we read the accounts of what is happening, what is being discussed in the French in Paris, and the French are claiming that every living person in French colony is actually a Parisian. Of course, it's rhetorical, but it's a very interesting claim. It is also a claim that every person living in their colony should be exposed to the French culture, the French language, etc., etc. So here, again, culture becomes a very important way. In fact, in the planning of Pondicherry, everything is taken into account, where you will have a mosque, where you will have a temple, who will live where. And of course, it is still a skewed relationship between the ruler and the ruled, but there is an idea of creating a city in a very centralized kind of a fashion. Yeah. And this is something just some other, since I had to cross-check my kind of arguments with other example, this is something we even find in many other French colonies like Algiers. So there was an existing old city, and when the French on the left-hand side finally make the city, they almost mirror that existing. So they were not afraid to engage with the existing, but of course they would appropriate the existing. but it shows a very distinct and a very different attitude to French, you know, approach to planning, if I may use the word, which was very distinct from the British. The Portuguese, on the other hand, had a very, I think that's again another very different attitude to city building. One is they have a huge history of they have a huge history of making colonial cities. This is Nagasaki in Japan, and they already have a planned city by 1580. Lisbon itself was again a city that they were very consciously looking at, and including places like Salvador in the 18th century were very well established uh, cities. So then, when we look at Portuguese presence in terms of Diu, Daman, or in the state of Goa, and Panjim as one of their later examples, then what are the kind of frameworks that we can begin to deploy if I need to analyze or uh, understand Portuguese colonial urbanism? One, and I think there are two or three things which is very exciting. One, the city was always governed by a municipality right from 17th 18th century, which was often led by professionals, which is a huge departure, if I may use the word, for that time. Then there was this very interesting, so the Portuguese cities were of course pushing the royal agenda, but they were also autonomous, and autonomy for a city, I think, is very, very important. So there was this delicate balance between the centralization coming from Lisbon and the cities, and you had, I would say, three centers of power. You had the municipality, you had the royalty and the state, and then you had the church, right? And then that's what you begin to find. The presence of a historical presence of municipality is also shown in so many different kind of municipal structures that you begin to find in places like Panjim. Other features that we begin to discover is this whole idea of public procession and parades, something that brings people together, creates a kind of a social cohesion. It, of course, reinforces royal authority through the municipal council. But that also seems to be something very, very vital in terms of an urban ritual. The other aspect about Portuguese cities was also a kind of a multicultural hybrid environment. Now that's truly, the cities here are a collection of diversity. There are reports where, of course, it is still as I say, the ruler and the ruled, or a colonizer and the colonized kind of a relationship. But then there is immense amount of kind of a mixing that is happening. There are reports where the particular governor is rejecting the racial superiority theory. Yeah, and city also in this case becomes a place of hybridity of some importance, socially speaking, and city becomes like almost like entry ports to the other world. So these were cities that collected the world because they were on the port, collected the world and collected everyone, and they were like almost like a circus of different characters, and they were also the entry points for them to move inside. So that's what I find very fascinating, and something that perhaps demands a lot more study than what how we have understood colonial Portuguese cities. And that's one area that I think needs a lot of work. And of course, then you have this question of the Catholic Church as almost a bridge between different cultures. It was a far more, and we know for the Spanish and the Portuguese, since they were coming from the Catholic tradition, unlike, let's say, the British, in this case, the church was very important, and perhaps it becomes a glue uh, in an environment that's very politically volatile. So no wonder, I think the recent or the last prime minister of Portugal was of Goan origin. So there is this still a kind of a connection, and perhaps the presence of municipality, perhaps the presence of the Roman Catholic Church has contributed to create this kind of an environment. Of course, one can begin to then discuss and debate, and I feel I also need to do further work here as to how exactly does it influence the form of the city. One thing that we can begin to observe is a distribution of municipal spaces. That is something that seems very obvious. It also shows a kind of a centrality of the church in terms of how it becomes an active space of the city, some brings the city whole together, etc. Yeah, so that's something that we begin to find. But what you also begin to find is a presence of, or the presence of, municipal work from a very, very early times. This whole thing about filling up lakes that were causing malaria, modifying nature, of course, because to create cities you have to move things around, creating new kind of plantation, and sometimes often using this whole idea of health and hygiene, like is always the case, to create a new city. And that's where the municipality, becomes kind of very, very useful. So I'll come to the last section. So I think what we kind of I gathered from the study of three different colonial rulers. So you have the French, you have the British, and you have the Portuguese. And I think they make for very interesting academic study. And one of the areas of research that also emerges is if we were to analyze colonial intentions, or even the outlook towards political rule, colonial political rule, and if we were to correlate that with city building, I think a lot of interesting things can have. I've spoken about it in more detail in my publication, but a lot of interesting things can emerge. The last one, which is something which I'm presently working more on, something I'm very passionate about, is this whole question of princely cities. Now we do know, and I'm sure this is like history 101, by princely cities. So Britishers, when they were ruling the country, they had two strategies, and one strategy was of direct rule, and the second strategy was, well, you can't rule everyone directly. You can do an indirect rule where the ruler, and I'm looking at states like Baroda, Gwalior, Hyderabad. They would say the ruler you have to, and this is Delhi Darbar, where all the rulers, princely state rulers, came to pay their whatever gratitude or respect to the queen. She was visiting India. The rulers have to surrender their part of their whatever sovereignty to the English rule. They have to swear an allegiance to that. They cannot keep an army. They cannot mint their own currency and stuff like that. And they only had limited autonomy. We have done a whole new chapter on this recently also. They only have limited autonomy. And these autonomy was what? Well, one of the things that was still in the hands of these princely states was actually civic affairs. And that is where kind of it becomes interesting. And in these princely cities, I found them to be most fascinating in terms of the kind of experimentation that took place. It was important that we study it because, for one, I believe that this is a kind of modernity that I would like to use the word indigenous, and rather seeing it only as a mimic modernity. And this is also the time when we find these rulers, this princely state, directly hiring professionals from all across the world, and sometimes they're not even consulting their British masters. And in some sense, it is also a very interesting case to where we can begin to question this simplistic binaries of modernity and tradition. So that kind of thing. Involvement of professional was one thing, and this is, for example, in the case of Baroda, we do know that Vishwesaraya, important, engineer, planner, was involved. You had Robert Chisholm, of course, he was there in many different cities. Here he was hired as a freelancer. We had a librarian from the US, and we had a botanist gardener from Germany, and they were all hired directly by the king. I'll take the example of Baroda state, but it might be true for many different cities. So Sayaji Rao Gaikwad starts something which was referred to as a library movement. And of course, the librarian from the US, Borden, was involved. And in every district of the Baroda state, a library was made. And the whole intention was to, and in places where you did not have a library, a bullock cart would bring the books there. And you have these wonderful photographs how small kids in the Central Library in Baroda they're shown things, they are exposed to this whole world of books, world of reading, including especially the girl child. And this is a library movement that was not sponsored by the British. That was not in, also that was not something where you have an active involvement of the British agent, because I don't think they were that keen. And this is a very interesting example where this partial autonomy that this princely state enjoyed was used to create a kind of, and Baroda is a good example of that, a kind of a social reform or a social movement, and also talk about many different things that happened in a very, very short period of time. So, library is one, uh, and also kind of large scale engineering projects, which were keeping in mind the growth of cities. Uh, the MS University, Maharaja Sayajirao University, started as a Baroda college. And in a lot of academic work, it has been referred to as a rebel university, which means that the British were dead against establishment of a university at this particular point. So they had different arguments why we don't need a university, or you could do with that and you could do with this. But the king here defies them and establishes a university, or a kind of a technical training college at that point in time. This is also examples, and they're all freelancers that are hired by the king to do different kind of architectural and urban projects. So you have these wonderful photographs of these kids learning watch repair. So this whole idea of vocational training that is very, very important. And there are this whole plethora of new institutions that begins to come up. In this case, it is the state of Baroda, or rather the city of Baroda, including hospitals. And you sometimes you even have a patron in one of the British family because of their connections. Because also remember that these rulers are very international in their outlook. They're traveling. They also have this kind of a very interesting relationship that they have made with the British gentry, with their citizens. They're traveling to Europe for medical reason, for often for medical reason, but also for recreation. And they meet, different people. And then you have something like a botanical garden that is set up, and which is also known as Sayaji Bagh. And right from the beginning, this was supposed to be a public place. This is not a garden that is made in front of a palace, but this is a garden that is from day one. Day one, it has to be public. And then what does this garden do? In some sense, it introduces this whole system of classification, a modern system of classification. And not only the garden, you have these suspension bridges, but then you also make a museum which is a collection of curious objects that perhaps the king has been collecting from all over the world, but also collection of objects that becomes a kind of a window to the world. It is, of course, one can really discuss and debate the hegemonic nature of a museum, or how this museum also glorifies the king, but also in its artifacts and in its content, it is trying to make an effort to do what many cities all across the world were doing at that point in time, that was to introduce scientific and modern outlook in their citizens. So that's the kind of city building. And I say city building, and I'll talk about how the city was being built while these new institutions of state, of library, of a college, of a botanical garden, and a museum were being made. But see what all was happening in a very short period of time, in the space of 40, 50 years. At the level of laws and policies, there's a major shift that begins to happen. Now, these were all things that in their autonomous space, these people could have done. And in forms of formation of new institutions, these are coming up. But what is more important from an urban morphology perspective is there is a very conscious departure from the fortified city. So the new city, or the expansion of the city, is not happening outside the walls of the city alone, but it is happening far away from the fortified city, which I think is psychologically speaking or philosophically speaking a very, very important departure. And the Baroda that we know today, and since I'm living here, I've kind of, or I've moved here just a few years back, so I'm able to also observe it, as an outsider sometimes, that the Baroda that I know today is absolutely formed on the armature of these new kinds of institutions that came up, where a very conscious effort was made to move them away from the city in a newer kind of a space. So, and that's what to my mind became the last point you need to ignore. So uh, this is what I have today. I just see if I can. How do I end this? End this slide. Just swipe forward to exit. Um, and what I'm. Can you see me now, Anuj?
Yeah, your screen is still blank. Yes,
Yeah.
now we can.
So in some sense, I know I've kind of picked up different examples from different eras, but if one were to really begin to see what's really happening to the cities, it's sometimes it is there's a promise but which is not fulfilled. Sometimes it is an appropriation of a certain order. It is the Sufism that comes to rescue in creating a kind of a space where I can be in some sense.
Mm,
And in the case of princely city is very exciting because that was not expected. I mean, the focus was Bombay and Calcutta and other places.
mm,
And of course, you do have this monumental spaces and in these cities also, but truly the experiments of making of a city, I'm talking about making of a city, and to my mind, it is the idea of publicness and an acceptance of diversity. I would look for that. So this is how I've looked at, uh, uh, different, different eras to make
right.
sense of them.
Yeah.
To, of course, I can't conclude with such range of literature, but hopefully, what this publication might do is it might allow scholars to then dwell into it in more. I mean, for each section that I have, I'm also offering a kind of a working framework right now.
Right.
So that's all it is. I would love to hear what you guys feel about it. Uh, yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much, Pratyush. I think it was a really nice kind of tracing of, the way in which um, collections of people have kind of grown. And while you were kind of laying these out, the four, I was making a lot of notes, and in the end, it all came somehow in some framework when you gave the example of the Baroda University. And I was thinking then that, one could think of the production of the city or the production of the phenomenon of the city through probably four kind of notions, which I could just gather, and I'm sure there are more. But, if I was to list them, one is through the notion of control, and how they produce the city, whether it be state control or the religious control, the belief control, and so on. And In response to that, there is the notion of the resistances and how they produce the city, in the sense of, how people want to live in a place together, and they constantly kind of engage and respond to those power forces and produce a certain kind of urbanity. The third is the notion of mobility, which is and mobility I'm using in a wide term to mean economic mobility, social mobility, political mobility, and how it produces the city. And one more could be the notion of knowledge, its deployment as well as engagement,
Mm,
in terms
mm,
of you come to a place to kind of learn something as a place of learning, as well as a place of deployment of that learning. And I was just to kind of place in this frame, in this kind of larger framework, just to place a few questions that I was thinking that it could be interesting to then look at that what were the institutions that got produced in the interactions of these forces, and not just in each of these periods that you brought forth, but also how did the kind of transition, how what new institutions also came up in the transition period, from one phase to another, because that would be a whole different kind of way in which institutions must have been rethought, because the complete philosophical foundation of living was kind of in flux. So yeah, I was just thinking if you could
Yeah, no, no.
yeah.
I think, and I think those 3, 4 ways of looking at cities is wonderful. I think that's the kind of leap of ideas that one needs, because otherwise you're stuck. See, I mean, the problem, and I'm talking more from a researcher issue. We get sometimes data can totally be overburdening,
Yeah.
and that's also the issue with cities, because sometimes the data itself is so overwhelming that one is not able to emerge out of it.
Mm, mm,
Um, and you're right about your second observation about institutions. So what are the kind of institutions that gets created?
mm,
And I would extend it further, that how does it relate with the production of a city or a formation of a city? So then the question is, what are the spaces of these
yeah.
institutions? And institutions, to my mind, are far beyond their building significance, because institutions impact uh, the larger experiences of the city beyond their physical presence. Uh, and that is another area, but it would also need some very deft and some very systematic, very sharp methods, because the problem is also, how does one go about doing it?
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
And like you
yeah,
were mentioning in the beginning, I think the answers or hints or clues may not be directly in in kind of architectural literature. We may have to kind of cross disciplines and enter
yeah,
these from completely different entry points.
yeah.
Um,
So, right, Anujan, I think for me, what the only reason I could pull it off, if I have really pulled it off, I really don't know, is to also get into literature
yeah,
by by people in cultural studies,
yeah,
sociologists and historians.
right.
In the absence of that, it is very difficult to form, it will not emerge from pure architectural or architects
Yeah,
or architectural historians work. Not at all. That is not of use. But then uh, the the thing about these other disciplines is they will not make a mention to the idea of a space.
mm,
Now that is
yeah,
where our role comes in,
right.
and we understand space,
Mm,
uh, the logic of space, the size, the extent, the location, way better,
yeah,
and that's our huge strength. Now, if we were to deploy that
mm,
with a kind of a deft understanding, because this literature is out there for quite some time.
mm,
I mean, for example, the whole literature on irrigation and South Indian history really has been there for quite some time, but somehow not many people have correlated it with urban spatial formations.
yeah,
And that whole the idea of a divinity, and then we being a religious South Asian being religious, and so we have these temple towns, and that narrative of Vastu Purush Mandal and all has somehow also blinded us and not allowed us to look at other things.
yeah, yeah. But also, I mean, just to extend this idea of institution, I think it could, and since you also mentioned that our expertise comes in the analysis of space and the culling out or drawing out of the spatial experience. And I was just also thinking that how do these morphings, and I could if I could refer to these four kind of aspects of control, mobility, resistances, knowledge, how do the morphings of these also result into certain types, which could be so interesting to enter looking at the production of the city itself. Because,
Yeah,
and again, types looking at one is in these very kind of periods, but also I'm actually super interested in this whole question of um, how does one phase transition into another, and of course the second
yes,
phase that comes over an existing layer never completely demolishes or erases the previous,
correct.
but actually kind of takes on and morphs itself with it, and that could produce a whole new philosophical way of inhabiting space itself,
Perhaps,
which
yeah,
gets kind of embedded into ways of how you experience the city. So,
yeah,
so it could be very interesting to use these typological kind of approaches to open up the idea of publics, the idea of gatherings, the idea of social formations, and so on. Um, and
yeah.
that would definitely require some amount of digging and
Yeah,
exploration.
I mean, it would also, as I said, you need a lot of base literature available or
Mm.
base studies available to mount that kind of an argument where one is able to crystallize on certain types. And
Yeah,
I think in case of Indian cities, especially from the perspective of form, we have a lot of data, but we do not have any baseline conceptual frameworks.
right,
It's
right.
only when you have some baseline frameworks you can begin to do the next level of sophisticated uh, readings, I believe.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I will. I'll just kind of uh, open up the question and answer box to see if we have two questions. And Prasad
Okay.
actually wants to make some comments. So if we can have Prasad, Dipti, if you can help us getting Prasad here.
Okay, there's some yeah,
Yes,
okay.
I thought that I'll just have Prasad and then take.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Hi, thanks, Pratyush. I
Thank
mean,
you.
for this amazing span and survey of, of the geography and time and emergence of form. So it's I think this was required, particularly in this uh, for this in this country and for the region also. Actually, this kind of uh, looking at looking at uh, looking across geography. Uh, I have three interconnected comments actually, and I picked and I was thinking while you were kind of going through your uh, presentation, uh, the way you are thinking of urban form, the way you are thinking of urban form, and how do you want to kind of define urban form really? How do you, because there is a cartographic definition of urban form which reduces city form into a diagram. You look at a top view of the city, you kind of see the city is growing in circles, whether things are located. There's a cartographic idea of urban form, which which usually historians across the world have mobilized to think of urbanity in terms of its form, the cartographic. And at many places, and particularly in when you came to the colonial city, you mobilized the idea of appropriation, the appropriation of institutions, of spaces that were created, etc. And and I felt that there is an opportunity to rethink the idea of urban form
Hmm.
through the architecture and form of appropriation.
Yeah.
No, I mean, remove the cartographic optic and
Hmm.
really enter into the streets and the nodes and the neighborhoods and the housing quarters and the and those areas, because it is in that dynamic, the agencies and the networks of 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 every day, that cities happened across the world, actually, like cities happened in those agencies and networks of people. And those moments are felt in those, non-monumental uh, uh, parts, the parts of the city which is of everyday, the streets, the neighborhoods, the nodes, the housing quarters, etc. So I felt that there is that opportunity to kind of rethink the idea of urban form, you know,
Hmm.
to kind of re-articulate our understanding of the non-cartographic way of looking at cities.
Yeah, I mean that's very interesting. In fact, it is. I'm too close to this work right now, and I think that's what you're doing. It's a very good thought that you are have been intuitively struggling with this idea that one cannot look at urban form in a classical sense, in a classical typomorphological sense, if I may use the word. That has to be questioned, and in some sense, with many different, uh, especially in case of princely cities and also in the colonial, the definition of or the classic cartographic view of a city will fail.
Yeah.
It'll royally fail for us to understand the city. And come to think of it, even if when I look at this whole idea of the outside, so the whole imagination of a city as a clarified diagram with a boundary. But this boundary is transcended every day when people walk to the Sufi saints. Every day that is questioned and transcended upon. In fact, your classical cartographical idea of the city again begins to collapse because of the way the cities established a relationship with the countryside, which was very unlike maybe other examples, maybe in some other cultures, yes. So you're right. And perhaps one needs to now, and for me personally, step away and see that inadvertently, maybe I'm already doing it in a very intuitive fashion.
Yeah.
But frankly speaking, I've never got into articulating my view on questions of the definition of urban form per se. I still need time to, you know what I mean? But it's a good discussion, In fact, if we were to not get, and that's what I mean, not get buried by data and by the nitty-gritty or nuances of the city, but actually look at maybe a seminar or something where we just look at. Very interesting though. I totally agree. In fact, now that you have said it, I'm already thinking that it's just the right question to ask. I'm not sure whether it is a question which is only valid to our context or
Not
would
at
it be
all.
valid?
Not at all.
It would be something that that demands an answer, I think, everywhere. Yeah, but yeah.
And just one footnote question, if you have some information on it, where did the grid of Jaipur come from?
So I see it now. I have in fact not given it too much attention. Purposely, because to my mind it is I wouldn't call it post-industrial, but it is a modern, it is a post-enlightenment idea of organizing a city. So in some sense, again, so the symbolism has sometimes not allowed us to look at the larger.
That's the problem.
So it's just that whole 9 square. I mean, I wish it would have been,
that is nonsense.
It would have been 7 squares. It would have made our life easier because we would have concentrated on where it is coming from. Where is this idea of, for example, the squares. where the roads meet are enlarged.
Yeah. They're expanded. Yeah.
And I think that's an international idea.
Yeah. But this is 70, that is 1724.
Exactly, that's 1724.
Yeah.
And it is an idea that was as much Indian and as much international. There's no point saying what is Indian about it, because those experiments were already happening across the world, and also including Jaipur, and including Old Goa or Pondicherry, right? So
much later,
I mean, so later around, So what I'm saying is, I see it as extremely modern, not in terms of modern movement, but modern in its outlook.
Yeah. That's thanks.
Yeah. So Prasad, that is why I in fact do not even, I just make a very small mention of it in my publication. I did not want to give too much attention to it, but then because it has to be first by me also studied in a very different fashion. So for example, for Baroda, we could track, or we could at least not track, but there was this German botanist, Krumberger, and there's a very nice documentary now that has come up where, and in this documentary, it's a whole account. I will send you the link, because the German they actually, so this particular gardener apparently was building big time gardens in India. And he was German. He was trained in UK, right? And then there's this whole account that Maharaja travels to UK, and in his garden, I think Kiln or some place in UK, he interviews this guy. And in the interview, he finds him all right and recommends, and he's brought to Baroda, right? So there is this Indian prince going around interviewing German gardeners, and so there is this kind of an sharing of ideas that was happening. And this is 1870s, right? So that's why, and I think Jaipur I would like to put somewhere in the same basket of professionals and sharing of ideas on city building.
Actually, Vikramaditya Prakash, in his analysis of Jaipur, he opens up the location, timing, and all of those things, but still doesn't open up the grid. Doesn't get into the grid and the form, really, the form question.
Correct.
He talks about variety of other things. Yeah. Go ahead, please.
Prasad, there are a few more questions and some audience, some people from audience raising hands. So I'll just go through them. First is Jaisim, Professor Jaisim Rao. He's asking the question the rise of third and fourth level cities with cultural settlement. How does one address it? He's just kind of posed it as a phrase.
I didn't quite get this.
If Jaisim is still here and we can get him.
Till then, we can take the next question, maybe.
Yes.
He's not in the panel.
He's
in the attendees. Sorry, he's not there.
Okay. If Jaisim connects us back, we can take that question. There is another question by Chinmay Redkar. He says, very nice presentation and research. Please, can you throw some light on how we can look forward to retrofitting cities by watching transit spaces microscopically?
Oh, that's a very specific question. It almost feels like a student struggling with a thesis topic right now. But I mean, thanks that you found my presentation interesting. No, I can now talk more if I have to relate with this historical. What I've covered today is really the historical aspects, and I think what Anuj was also talking about while he was commenting on my work on this whole question of institution and how institution, the purpose, the meaning, and then I would say the form of institution. So when you retrofit, I'm just giving you when we retrofit, what is it that we are doing? Are we creating a new arrangement? And when we say institution, I'm referring to a pattern that is predictable, that can go on, a systemic kind of a relationship that is formed in the society. So when we retrofit, what do we really do? I mean, I'm just giving, it's a very difficult question to answer, but when we retrofit, do we continue with institutional pattern? That's one way to ask. Do we question and destabilize and a known institution that we want to question, and in the process create a new one? Yeah, so if I were to enlarge this idea of retrofitting and see it as a larger kind of a formation or a realignment of urban institution, because that's what you would end up doing if you're retrofitting, it could be a very interesting urban question to ask. Because what I'm also imagining is the person who is asking is also trying to look for certain larger frameworks, urban frameworks that can be deployed to understand retrofitting rather than seeing it only as a physical exercise. So perhaps I might like to look at the type, one way is the type a retrofitting creates. And the type again is something related to an idea of institution, because a type is something that has a known relationship or known at least a predictable relationship that goes on. Would be a interesting way to understand retrofitting with institution and type as two kind of things around it.
There's Rohit from our team who would like to pose a question. So,
Sure.
if you can help us get Rohit here.
Hi, Pratyush. Thanks for that lovely talk. And I think
Hi, Rohit.
it is very relevant and important as an exercise to do at this moment, particularly to introduce religion as a vector in the writing of urban history and the history of urban form. So, by introducing religion as a trope to think around the writing of history is what you've really done, and very importantly is to open out the idea of institutions, not organizations, but institutions of social life, into thinking about urban form. So while you were going through your talk and through your presentations, there were a few thoughts that came to my mind, which I'm trying to organize and put forth. What seemed to happen in your talk as you kind of introduced religion as an institution that has shaped urban form? The other institution or the other idea, or the concept that you were also working around was the idea of the public, which also needs to be opened out as some work has happened, has been done. Say, for instance, Dipesh Chakravarti's definition of the idea of the public in the Indian context in times of colonial modernity. But the public needs to be opened out along with the question of urban form. Because as one goes through your presentation, the idea of the public emerges in the context of in the pre-colonial city. It is located outside the city, whereas colonial city, it emerges as a movement, resistance against colonization. It enters the city. I'm just wondering that and I'm just thinking through to build on your hypothesis that the religion builds a diagram of power. If one starts with your first slide and kind of further, but any diagram of power also has points, places, or spaces from which opposition can kind of emerge. And is it that they were always in the pre-colonial era, they were located outside the city? For instance, where might one put, for instance, the Bhakti movements, and where were they kind of located? Even a work like Begumpura, I mean, did it kind of emerge outside the city? The church then emerges as an institution which is more moderate than others. But there is, for instance, Ashish Nandi's work on the idea of cosmopolitanism in the subcontinent, which works through mutual adjustment as against the idea of the Chicago school urbanists, which they drew from Simmel, and which is something that comes through your definition of the public. So there is an idea of cosmopolitanism, and how did it kind of work through in settlements or in cities that were organized hierarchically? Where did the spaces of crossovers, boundary crossovers of resistance emerge with incident? That might be an interesting hypothesis or work to build upon. And then a range of institutions, religion, caste, gender could be opened out through these things. I mean, it's an observation, a thought. Maybe you could.
No. It's very interesting. And I think, in fact, you very eloquently also summarized, this whole question of the space outside, or the space that emerges out of resistance inside the city during the colonial era. In fact, there are other sections where you might find answers, because I purposely picked up some of the extreme examples, let's say Deccan. Yeah. There are in the examples of the trade cities, and I'm talking about trade cities between 14th to 17th, 18th century in the drier parts of India, Rajasthan and Gujarat. Some of the spaces emerge through a kind of a mercantile,
Sarai, for instance.
Exactly, Sarai, for instance. We read in Jodhpur that there is a lodge for Marwadi youths who come from the village to get better integrated to the ways of the city, and then they move into the city, right? So there are examples there as well. And I find a lot of examples emerge from the idea of these associations of merchants. Of course, then the question really is, the space that one is talking about is actually the market space more than anything else. Especially in the case of Ahmedabad, the whole idea of the market seems to be the prominent space where I can find a measure of publicness, for example. So I won't argue, or I won't put a kind of a simplistic conclusion that pre-colonial time, the idea of the public was always outside the city. In fact, it came out as that more in the case of the Deccan, as one of the examples. But it really varies a lot. I mean, it's very difficult to define a singular pattern.
No, I mean, what you mentioned over there in those spaces outside the city, more the idea of cosmopolitanism, that they accommodate all rather than public. I'm also one thing kind of intrigued me is that when you mobilize the definition of indigenous modernities, for instance, kind of want to work with critiquing the romance of the writing of Indian history. And I'm just thinking, how does the trope of indigenous modernity, or the idea of multiple modernity, or a different modernity that has come to us conceptualized in the work of Dipesh Chakravarti or Arjuna Padurai, and also being critiqued that it has the potential to kind of fall into the hands of the Hindu right. But Dipesh Chakravarti has also responded. I'm just wondering, what would your thoughts on this be? Because you're considering this writing through a critical frame, and the religion becomes an important institutional trope for your analysis.
Yeah, I think you opened up many questions here. Of course, I begin my lecture by, in some sense, critiquing this notion of that whole idea of romance of the Indian city. And that's exactly, in some sense, through my different case studies, what I'm trying to discover is a framework that I can use, that I can begin to use. To my mind, and also somehow it also matches up with the kind of intentions you have in this symposium of Beyond the Metropolis. To my mind, there are examples that were beyond the regular gaze, where we find interesting experimentation of city building. Yeah. And somehow, sometimes some of these examples were reduced by by some scholars as being a kind of a mimicking. Yeah, it is a mimicked form. It is something that one is doing to please the colonial master, and you do not want to take it very seriously because it is just a stylization that's mimicking. What I'm arguing is that it also, in some sense, was a counter-colonial narrative, this form of assertion. And it was a very delicate assertion because you could not go all out to defy the British agent that would be sitting in the city. So it's still early days as far as I'm concerned in this area, especially in I think the princely city area needs a lot of work, but whether it falls into the hands of that anything one can create a narrative, but then I think it's an important area to study along with what was happening in colonial cities at the same time. And I think we have also been trying to figure out that if there was a college that was made in Baroda or in Gwalior versus a college that is made in places where you have a direct rule, is there a difference in the attitude? Is there a difference in the typology? Is there a difference in the rhetorical claim what a college is supposed to do? And I think perhaps if one were to see it more carefully, one can begin to find certain patterns. And I mean, there are many princely cities that absolutely did not deploy or use this autonomous status. In fact, it became an exercise of indulgence, where the palaces became bigger and bigger, and the garden in front of the palaces, almost like Baroque garden, became bigger. So it's not something that can also be applicable to all princely cities. It was only something that happened and perhaps it happened in states that were financially very powerful, and they contributed a lot to the British treasury to be able to demand that kind of an autonomy. So those are my thoughts. I don't know whether I answer your question, but still,
Thanks.
Rohit, for opening up more dimensions to this discussion. And we don't have any more questions, and so maybe I think we have arrived at the end. But I think thank you so much, Pratyush, for such a wide kind of bringing us to such a wide spectrum of examples through which we could delve into so many aspects of urbanism, thinking about cities, and thinking about questions of all everything that surrounds metropolises and beyond the metropolis. We really appreciate that, and with that, I'll conclude the lecture and invite the audiences for our next lecture in the session in this symposium, which will be just a fortnight down the line, and we'll update the details on our website soon. So thank you so much for participating, and see you on 18th February. Thank you.
Thank you.